And we are now 3 chapters into Genesis. So we're making good speed.
Like 50?
So Adam and Eve have children. I think that's pretty obvious, but there is a controversy with this. I'm just kidding. There's not, because they have children. All right. Now, Cain and Abel are the only 2 right off the bat that are named, but like I said, there are most likely others. So, Adam and Eve have children. Next one. Cain and Abel are the only 2 that are named that we have record of. We know there are others. Really quick, why do we know there were others? Okay, Cain marries someone, and he has to marry another human, because that's how that works. And if there aren't other humans on the planet, he can't marry anyone. So there have to be other humans. All right? So there you go. That is like a huge thing where people are like, where did Cain get his wife? And it's like, he married his sister. That's gross. Well, yes, but they didn't know that back then. All right? And so there you go. Cain offers a poor sacrifice and is rejected. I'm just summarizing the story. We can get into some of the details in just a sec. Abel offers a proper sacrifice and is accepted. And then to summarize it all, Cain kills Abel and is marked and exiled. Now, there are all sorts of theories on what the mark of Cain is. Some people are like, oh, he got like this horn on his head. And there's all sorts of theories. We don't know. Long story short is the Bible never tells us what the mark of Cain is. It could have been like a tattoo on his forehead, or it could have been something, but whatever it was, God marks Cain, and basically this marking says, if you kill him, there are going to be some pretty bad consequences to what you've done. So, if we compare it to the feuds from down south, when you kill one of my family members, this feud is going to go on for like 400 years. Okay, just imagine the people who would be out to kill Cain because of what he did. So he basically says, if you throw me out, I am going to be a vagabond. No one's going to accept me. They're going to all try to kill me, which again implies that there are more people on the planet right now. So that's why I mentioned the fact that there has to be a good bit of time between creation of Adam and Eve and this whole scenario, because one, Cain and Abel are old enough to do sacrifice, and also there are people in the earth that Cain is afraid of. So either you go the route of there's people who aren't descended from Adam and Eve, or you go the route of Adam and Eve had other kids who already left and went and started settling other places, and then this whole instance with Cain and Abel happens. Yes, Mary's nephew. Now, one of the theories, I don't believe this at all, but one of the theories I heard one time, I was sitting in on a Genesis class, and this guy was teaching, and he's like, Cain, those guys could have popped out and grown up like instantly. Because, Eve said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And so therefore, I don't know that he really believed it, but the fact that he shared it in a non-joking sort of way, I was like, maybe it's one of those instances of like the flaming sword in the Garden of Eden where my friend said that and I was like, oh, you're stupid. And then I realized, oh no, he's probably right. Maybe, maybe. I doubt it though. All right. So anyway, so this obviously takes place a good chunk of time after the creation. So we're probably looking 20 years or so. Adam and Eve obviously have had other kids. They've moved on. Cain and Abel have this falling out with each other. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And Cain kills Abel. And then God marks Cain and says, this mark will be a protection for you so that they don't hunt and kill you. So that's kind of that summary of how that works. Just a little bit here. The question arises, why on earth was Cain's sacrifice rejected and Abel's not? So this is one theory for why Cain's sacrifice was rejected. It could just be God's sovereign choice. It could be God looked at it and said, I'm going to accept that one, but not that one. God has the right to do that. That seems a little bit outside of his character to just randomly be like, haha, you yes. Normally there's something more behind the scenes. There's a hard attitude or something. But if you look throughout the Old Testament, you do see times where God just randomly chooses one person to the expense of another. So Jacob and Esau. The Bible says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. There's nothing that either one of them did to make God say, I love you and I hate you. Like, God just said, I'm choosing this one, not choosing that one. So that there is a precedent to it. So there's not like completely unheard of. Not the way I go. But again, it would fit. If you're talking to the children of Israel, that actually does work almost. Because there was nothing special about Abram. God chose him. Just said, I'm going to make a nation out of you. Now Abram would then show himself to be a faithful man, and so maybe he had some of those characteristics leading up to this point. But there's nothing that just was like, amazing. You see that with Noah. The Bible says, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. That is the reason the scriptures record. Noah found grace in the eyes, but God chose Noah. It said he was perfect in his generations, which is a very interesting phrase that we may or may not get into. But it could really be that. The other thought is not a blood sacrifice. So Cain offered plants, Abel offered blood. So again, Abel was accepted and Cain was rejected. That's another theory for why that worked that way. What I would like to do is take a look at the text itself and see if you can pick up on any hints given in the text itself. So in Genesis, I have not used this Bible in a long time. It's like my office Bible. So in Genesis chapter 4, it says in verse 1, and Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord, which clearly means he popped out full grown. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, which basically means in some day, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering of the Lord. So that's all we get. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of the flock, of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel in his offering, but to Cain and to his offering he had not respect. Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. So what hints do we have in the text that give you some idea of what made one accepted and not the other? I don't necessarily grow with either of these explanations, to be completely honest. There's a hint in the text if you read it. There's something about it that would make it so that Cain's offering basically deserved to be disrespected, and Abel's offering not deserved, but had more merit to it. What do you think? Okay. What would give you an idea that there was some attitude involved here?
Well, I've always thought, like, I've heard it before, it's not original with me, but the idea of, like, he could have gotten a sheep, he could have gotten a goat, whatever, he could have gotten a blood sacrifice that God asked for. So there's an attitude of pride of...
But it doesn't say that God asked for a specific offering. Yeah, because the law hasn't been written down yet.
But what they would have been taught by what God had shown Adam and Eve, right? Is that...
You're bringing it up, and I'll comment when you guys are done. What do you think?
Because like that's what God does with Adam and Eve, like to show them that's how they cover their sin. Is he kills that goat and covers their nakedness, which was the picture of that. So that's what that sacrifice was supposed to be, maybe in that maybe what they were taught.
Okay.
Could have gotten that from Abel, so there's an attitude of pride.
Okay. Anything else? What do you think?
What I was always taught was that when they both brought their sacrifices, Abel came with a humble attitude, and Cain came like proudly, and even like in verse 5 it says he was very wroth, so he was angry when God didn't accept his sacrifice.
Okay.
Which shows like an already, which shows kind of like an already, you don't just like all of a sudden just find out it's going from this from.
What chapter is it again?
Chapter 4. All right.
Is
So
there anywhere where God tells Adam and Eve that they have to give a blood sacrifice, or is that just like with the?
No, it does. That's why.
Like it doesn't say anything about sacrifice.
nope.
But when it came to it,
It's almost like at first glance it seems kind of like, well, God's being rude because like Cain works with the vegetables in the garden and Abel works with the flocks. They both brought something of what they do, what they have. Like at first it's kind of like, well, why would you not accept? Nah, I feel like it's not completely important, which is why it wasn't.
Okay.
So you don't see anywhere up until he was very wroth and his countenance fell anything about his attitude. And so, like you said, I mean, you can try to make the argument that, well, he didn't just instantly become angry, but like, I mean, I've had times where like I'm having a good day and something happens and I'm like, okay, now I'm upset. Like,
Yeah.
But normally
so that can
comes
happen.
From a background, like.
I mean, it can, but like, I know people that
Yeah.
mood swing angry drop of a hat. So
Yeah.
like I wouldn't say that that's plausible. I would say that what shows that he has a wrong attitude is not the fact that he got upset. It's the fact that God did not accept the offering. That in and of itself shows that there's not a right attitude.
Yep. So we put all that together. Some of the things that we know for sure, we know that there was some sort of sacrifice. There would have been some sort of instructions given. We don't know what those instructions are. If you know anything about the Jewish traditions, you know there were such a thing as bloodless sacrifices. So in the beginning of Leviticus, I believe he'll talk about you can have free will offering, and this is what you do. You're going to bring some sort of meal.
Well, they were supposed to.
You know, yeah.
They were supposed to offer like the first fruits and things like that.
Yeah, and so you would, and so there's definitely a precedent for offering first fruits. There's definitely a precedent for offering grain and oil, and there's things like that it is not unheard of to say plants could be an offering. However, I think Cameron brings up a good point. The only other time we've seen something killed up till this point has been God killing the animal to cover Adam and Eve. So you could very easily follow that pattern and say, most likely there was some sort of blood sacrifice, or at least the pattern was there. We don't know though. It's not clearly told to us what type of sacrifice this is. We don't know if this was a sacrifice to kind of, a sin offering. We don't know if this was just a celebration that they were, we don't know what this is. But I want you to draw attention to a few of the facts. I think Cameron, again, brought up the good point of, even if it was a blood offering, Cain could have traded for something. It wasn't beyond his ability. Pretty sure Abel wouldn't have been like, oh, you're not taking my, no, like, pretty sure there was the ability to get whatever God required. But you also notice, and I find this interesting, look specifically at verse 3. It says, in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering to the Lord. So if you look at the way that's worded, it's just, he went out, harvested fruit of the ground, brought it to the Lord.
It's not the first fruits.
It's not, there's no wording of first fruits. There's not even a wording that this is excellent. It's just, he went out and got stuff, brought it. Now, I don't know that Cain had like a flippant, arrogant attitude. We don't know that. But the point, counterpoint sheds light on each other. So if you look at the way Cain is described, it says he brought of the fruit of the ground. It says nothing about first fruit. An offering to the Lord. It says nothing about it being good. So for all we know, which is a bit of an assumption, but it's a grounded one, he could have just brought whatever. So Cain is approaching this seemingly with an attitude of whatever, which is a very realistic reaction that a lot of people have to God. It's this is just what I do, take it or leave it. But I want you to notice specifically with Abel, what does God say about Abel? Abel brought of the firstlings of the flock. That's a really important word that is not found in Cain's description. He brought of the firstlings of the flock and of the fat thereof. That's like the good stuff. So this isn't like a scrawny firstborn. This is like the nice stuff. So he's bringing really good things. And it says, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. God isn't just flippantly respecting Abel just because. Something about Abel's sacrifice, which seems to be the first fruit, the fat thereof, seems to say, God said, I approve of that. So he accepts it. Under Cain, he says, no, that's not appropriate. Cain gets mad. Abel obviously doesn't get mad because, God accepted his offering. But Cain gets mad, and apparently God has enough of a relationship with both of these that he can actually interact with Cain. So we're not looking at Cain as just like the epitome of all evil. He does this wrong thing, but look what happens. It says Cain was very wroth. So whatever happened, Cain was very upset with this response, and it bothers him. And look what it says. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you wroth? Why is thy countenance fallen? And he says, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. So something about what Cain did in not offering first fruits, not offering it well, God said, I would have accepted it if you had done it right. But then he said, if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And you see the same phrase here that you saw earlier with Eve, and it said something about your desire shall be to your husband. So that's where we kind of get this hint at what that phrase means, because it says, unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. And so the idea seems to be with this phrasing that, and again, it's a confusing phrase, but what it seems to be saying is, Cain, if you're not careful, your desires are going to be dominated by sin. Like sin is going to take over and start telling you what to do. And there seems to be kind of that, you're basically about to walk into a trap, Cain, and if you're not careful, everything you do is going to be in the service of sin, or basically filtered through that lens. That seems to be what God is saying here. And then if you look at verse 8 and following, you kind of see the outpouring of that warning, where he doesn't heed the warning, and this is what happens. So before we move any farther, questions or comments on that explanation? Yeah.
I think there's something significant about how it says he offers the fat, because even you see later, like, the priests are allowed to eat the fat of the offering. So there's like an extra step of,
he's not skimming off.
Maybe that wasn't even required. Like, maybe like that was something that he was like fine to keep the fat, but like.
Yeah, and that was a big thing. Like there were, I don't know that there's any real connection because we're talking Greek mythology, which is way later. But there's this fun mythology in Greek. Prometheus tricks Zeus into eating garbage, basically. And so the way the myth goes is Zeus is requiring sacrifice from humans. And Prometheus tells the humans, here's what you do. You take all the garbage, you wrap it in the fat, this nice, delicious stuff. Put that over here. And then put the stuff you want to keep over in this pile. And so what Zeus does is he looks and he sees this delicious, fatty meat that looks really good, and he eats that. And that becomes his offering, but turns out it's basically the bones and the scraps. They just happen to be wrapped in fat. So because Prometheus tricked Zeus, Prometheus gets a pretty severe punishment for it. But that's just kind of an instance to give you an idea of how important fat was. It's the good stuff. And so I think that's a good observation, because as you look at Abel, the firstlings is obviously what God expects. So, even the Levites, as you look later, they're going to be like the offering in place of all the firstborn among Israel. And so God is basically going to say, I expect the first because it's typically the best. But I do think that's a good observation, because he's seemingly giving above and beyond. We don't know for sure, but that does seem to be what's going on there. So yeah, really long comment, but we'll stop. Anyway, other comments on that? Okay, so as we look, like I said, it really could be just the sovereign choice. But again, if you read the text, there seem to be a lot of hints that draw attention to an attitude. Again, it could be that Cain's was just poor quality. Abel brought the best, Cain brought whatever. Or again, it could be an attitude problem. And so really, any of these could be a solution, or it could be a combination of parts of several. Because again, you look at you look at Cain's reaction. He gets super angry. Almost like he feels he was done wrong by. But as you look, a lot of times that's a poor response that was caused by a poor action anyway. And so anyway, you go on. You see kind of by what Cain does next, He probably wasn't in a good spiritual state anyway. Some things to consider, like I said, there's no technical difference between Cain's and Abel's occupation. Nothing about Abel's occupation makes him a better man. It's not like, ooh, you care about sheep. Like nothing about sheep made it better than farming. In fact, if you want to be very technical about it, farmers were probably more important because you couldn't eat animals yet. Remember, like God ordained it for them to eat the plants of the field. So if anything, Cain's occupation was probably more important because that's actually how they were supposed to eat. Sheep would have been good for probably milk and coats and other things. But again, we don't necessarily get that case of eating meat until after the flood. Again, something about this festival seems to have been special. We don't know what, since God doesn't tell us, but we know it came at a set point where they were supposed to bring their offerings. So again, those things are all there to kind of help set the stage that this is a special ceremony. They knew what they were supposed to do, and apparently whatever it was, whatever reason we covered today fits, Cain didn't do it right. And so there. I have heard pastors say like Cain had this really flippant, arrogant attitude and it had nothing to do with the blood. And I've bought into that at various times in my life. I've also heard it was the blood sacrifice. That's what really mattered. And I bought into that one too. So I think very well it could have been a combination of things. Because again, the only sacrifices we've seen up to that point are blood. But again, there's something about Cain's attitude, something about the fact that Abel really, really went above and beyond to basically bend over backwards for God's sake. That seems to be part of it here. And then, of course, the bad attitude fits as well. Okay. Okay. If it's God's sovereign choice, which I don't know necessarily, then nothing is going to tell us one way or another. So we don't have to worry about it. So if it's God's sovereign choice, then it's just God's sovereign choice. That's why I don't really buy into that option right off the bat, because Moses is including this story for a reason. There's a purpose to this story. It's the idea of there is a way to please God, and sometimes when you please God, things go bad. I mean, so there's some story threads that are pulsing throughout this, including, hey, murderers exist from the beginning. There's that temptation. When you're a murderer, you are basically ruled over by sin. So, I mean, there's a lot of different applications you can make. Like I said, the not blood part, this could be what Hebrews 11:4 could be referring to, but in Leviticus you do see non-blood offerings. So since we don't know what the sacrifice was for, we can't definitely say, but again, we have some hints. As far as the not best, again, Proverbs 21:27 would say that a sacrifice of a wicked is abominable. So the Bible talks about that. The sacrifice of the wicked man is abominable to the Lord. So if Cain were to have an evil heart, then his sacrifice would be rejected. Again, Hebrews 11:4. I keep referencing Hebrews 11:4, so let's look at it real quick. Hebrews 11:4 says this. It says, "By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by the which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it being dead yet speaketh." So, again, Abel is there in that hall of faith, as we call it, and it's basically just saying, hey, he showed he was righteous and Cain wasn't. All right, and then again, wrong motive, God loveth a cheerful giver. You could think of that verse, and potentially it would fit in here. So, what do we think? Well, the word for offering is not the usual word for sacrifice. So when we talk about the offering here, it is not your usual word that comes with a blood offering. It does seem more of a gift. And then again, Genesis 4:7 is how God reacts to Cain's actions. So again, there's plenty of grounds to say otherwise, but we don't know. Hey.
First of all, the thing that keeps going like everywhere, is that a problem?
Not the problem. Keep on, get up.
All right. So there you go. There's those things. So moving on. All right, Genesis 4:7. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. If thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Few observations. This is a very complicated reading. Okay, you read it like that, you're kind of like, huh? It's one of those things where if you read the individual words, you're kind of left going, I don't know what that means. But when you read it, you get the sense of what he's trying to say, even though the words can be confusing. Hopefully I'm not the only one who has that reaction. Like, if you break this apart phrase by phrase, because it's like, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Huh? But again, these are expressions, these are figures of speech. We get what it's trying to say, even though the figures of speech don't quite make sense to us. All right? So what we're getting at here is sin is portrayed as a predator. The language in the end mirrors what God told Eve earlier in Genesis, that basically her desire would be to her husband and he shall rule over thee, that whole thing. Okay? So this is specifically what God told Eve. Thy desire shall be to thy husband and he shall rule over thee. Okay? And so there's some level of, there is going to be this wickedness that Cain is now in authority over. You know, it's bad news for Cain. All right? So if he lets this happen, sin's going to get him, and now he's going to basically be responsible for sin. Okay? So just pointing out that similarity there. Genesis 3:16. Come on. As we connect these two verses, this is one of the aspects. The woman would be forced to be under the man. He would control her in many ways. And so that's the idea here. God is looking at Cain and basically saying, you can turn now and you can rule over sin, or you can be ruled by it. So he's basically giving Cain these options of basically saying, you can be the master in this situation so sin doesn't take control of you, or you can keep going and sin will actually be your master and you'll be slave to it. So which are you about to choose, Cain? You'll see this play out later on in Scripture, because God will talk about you are no longer the slaves of sin. And so that's an image, like, we as Christians really have the authority to say no to sin now, whereas before we were saved, it told us what to do. So I think what God's doing to Cain is he's presenting him with a choice to basically say, Cain, you're about to make a decision that's going to choose who your master is going to be. Either you're going to be the master in the situation and sin will not dominate you, or you are about to walk through the door and sin's going to take control and you're now going to be its slave. So you kind of see that word picture playing out. Again, Cain is viewed elsewhere. So there's a lot of other verses in the Bible that talk about Cain. So really quick, before we move on to the rest of this account, let's look at some of this. Matthew 23:35. Abel is described as righteous, obviously in contrast to the person who killed him, who is described as unrighteous. So Cain is not presented in a good light. 1 John 3:11 says this, for this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Not as Cain, who was of that wicked one and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil and his brother's righteous. Marvel not, my brethren, if the world hate you. And so again, we get this picture of Abel is a picture of the Christian who is doing the right thing, who is pleasing God. God accepts it, and he rejects the world, and the world is envious and jealous at that and kills Abel in response. So it's a symbol. Jude 10 and 11 says this, talking about these fake Christians who are in the church who are kind of corrupting things. It says, but these speak evil the things which they know not, but what they know naturally as brute beasts, and those things they corrupt themselves. Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain. So it's talking about their basically reaction to godly people. They ran greedily after the error of Balaam, remember the whole donkey talking situation, and have perished in the gainsaying of Korah, who the earth opened up and swallowed. And so Cain is referenced repeatedly for being unrighteous, for being a murderer, for being evil, for hating his brother. So you get that image. So though Genesis wouldn't present every aspect of that picture, at least not initially, you nonetheless get the impression of this is a guy whose spiritual problems go deep. So this is more than just like a surface thing. There's a heart issue here. Okay, a little bit more info. There's a commentary called the Cain and Abel. Has some good information on how this wasn't necessarily a mandated sacrifice. Some other historical bits, so you can do some comparisons with linguistics and all that wonderful stuff. One of the things he notes is a guy by the name of Hoffman, who's basically says, the reason is to be found that rather in the fact that Abel's thanks came from the depth of his heart, while Cain's merely offered to keep on good terms with God. So perhaps that was part of it. God talks to Cain as to a willful child, draws out of him what is sleeping in his heart and lurking like a wild beast before his door. So it's the idea of like when a kid throws a temper tantrum and you sit down with the kid and you're like, hey, what's going on? And then you start finding more and more issues that you start realizing there's a reason this kid is acting up. That's almost the impression you get when God is talking to Cain. Like this is kind of an arrogant child, or a child who will not submit. And so basically he warns him, and it says what he did to Cain he does to everyone who will but observe his own heart and listen to the voice of God. Cain paid no heed to the divine warning, and that's where we go next. All right, Cain doesn't listen to God's counsel. He kills Abel, and so that's where we get in the text. We don't know what he killed him with. Probably a rock, but who knows. It says this, Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I know not, am I my brother's keeper? And so God is extremely patient. I can't imagine like talking to a human and as God and being like, hey, where's your brother? And you're like, I don't know, it's not my problem. Like
you just killed him.
But you see that where God comes to Cain and says this, and Cain's like, I'm not my brother's keeper, I don't know. God knows what you did. Like, this isn't a shock. There are times where God asks a question not because he wants to know, because he wants to basically stir a conscience to say like, I know what you did. Do you know what you did? And look what happens. And it says this, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And so God doesn't even banter back and forth with Cain. He basically says, all right, do you realize what you've done? Thou art now cursed from the earth, which has opened up her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face I will be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever shall slay Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod to the east of Eden. And so, what you get this picture of, I find this deliciously ironic, that Cain just murdered his brother, and God says, all right, there's going to be a punishment for it. Your punishment is you are going to be a vagabond, which means you're going to be in exile, and you will not be able to farm anymore. So you're going to have to like really work to get your food. So therefore, you're now on your own. And Cain's like, it's too much of a punishment. And I look at that and go, you literally just murdered your brother because he got something you didn't get. What on earth, man? But that was his response. He was so blinded by selfishness that he basically said, I deserve better than this. And it's like, you just killed someone. Like, what on earth? So I just, again, I always found that kind of funny. As you see it, he says, I'm my brother's keeper. Obviously, God knows what's happened. Cain is cursed, so he's exiled from the garden. So obviously it's not the Garden of Eden, but from the place where he would till. And he now becomes a vagabond until he founds a city by the name of Enoch. Now again, don't confuse that with, there's several Enochs in this first few chapters of Genesis. They typically explain who they are, but you're gonna find a few of those. All right, he's gonna he is going to establish a city by the name of Enoch. Cain's wife. Okay, he goes out, he founds a city, and again, apparently more of Adam and Eve's children had already left at that point that he could set up a city. Like, it's not directly stated, but it's kind of an understood thing. Now again, the only other conclusion we could come to is if they weren't Adam and Eve's kids, whose kids were they? They would have had to be Adam and Eve's, unless you had other humans living on the earth at that time. So there you go. Yep, basically. Now, as far as the precedent of marrying siblings, Abraham, he married a half-sister. His descendants married cousins or other near relatives. So this early history has a lot of people marrying close relatives. When there aren't many people on the earth to marry, you obviously have no choice but to marry relatives. So there you go. So now again, if you do the math, here's the math someone did one time. Adam and Eve homeschooled, right? You know, because obviously that's the only schooling they could have done. And we all know that homeschool families have about one kid a year, because that's very typical. Now, assuming no twins or triplets, Adam and Eve, they lived about 900 years, right? So just think about it. They had a lot of kids. So the final conclusion is Eve must have looked like Jabba the Hutt at the end of that.
Wow.
It's like, I was with you all the way up until the end there.
So maybe we need to calculate that into the equation. They're not having.
Yeah. But if they had twins or triplets ever, so.
Yeah, that's true.
But then the Bible says that Sarah was above childbearing age when she hit about 100.
I know, but that's well after the flood, so.
Yeah.
So where?
It still could be like.
It could have been from like.
All the way up
Look, we
until
get the Jabba the Hutt comment makes you uncomfortable, but
So those are some of the wonderful lessons you learn at camp. John had a camper who did that. He was like, so if, and he started, it's like, she looked like Jabba the Hutt at the end of it, right? And he's like, what's wrong with you? So anyway, so once you start figuring in though, so you figure Adam and Eve are living for 900 years, okay? Several of the others, if you do even just some of the chronology work after the flood, like Abraham would have been alive at the same time probably as, Shem, and so some of those characters. So when you start doing the overlap and you're like, whoa, that means these characters were all alive at the same time. Yeah. I mean, Adam and Eve would have been alive to see their great, ridiculous levels of grandchildren. So when you do the math and you think about how rapidly a population can grow, let's say you get married at anywhere between 15 and 20 years, and then you start having kids, and then they get married at 15 to 20 years, and they start having kids, and the environment is such that it's not like, you stop having kids at a certain point because you're healthy and the environment is actually good, because the pre-flood environment would have been really, really good. And so as you start looking at that, you're like, all right, so Adam and Eve really could have had kids for 100 years or two. I mean, it probably would not be unreasonable, which means they could be having kids at the same time as their grandkids are having kids, which could mean the same time as their grandkids. Like, there could be a lot of kids, and especially in an age where having kids was less deadly. It's still painful, it's still a process, but there's probably a lot more health. There's not the genetic mistakes that there are today that would lead to bleeding out and dying as much in childbirth. You do that math and you're probably like, okay, a population could boom really quick. Even amongst someone who, it starts out at 5 or 6 people, but once you start going on from there within a few decades, I mean, you're probably a pretty good population. And so when it talks about Cain founding a city, it's probably not like a bustling New York City metropolis, but it's probably not a bad size. So, anyway, so just some things to think about as we do that. So mankind's spreading out. There's a lot of firsts. So Genesis 4:19 is the first guy to take an extra wife. So this guy by the name of Lamech.
but we can do that.
Yeah. Lamech took to him 2 wives. The name of one was Ada and the other was Zillah. So he married A to Z. So Ada bore Jabal, and there you go. Jabal is the father of all those who dwell in tents and raise cattle, because Abel's dead, so somebody has got to take the mantle. And so you've got Jabal, he does that, and then you've got his descendants named Jubal. There you go. So you got Jabal and Jubal. Jubal is the father of musicians, so those who work with the harp and the organ and all of those things. So again, you've got some sort of metallurgy going on here. You've got some intelligence. This is not just like trivial, like, oh, look what I made in the craft shed at camp. It's like, no, these are guys who know what they're doing. You've got this wonderful name, Tubal-Cain, who's a brass and iron smith. So just some interesting connections here as you go. But again, that's the descendants of Cain. And then you've got this guy by the name, again, Lamech, who we've talked about. It says, and Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. just would be a wonderful way to start a conversation with Deb. Hear my words, O wife of Mike. Anyway, hearken my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding and a young man to my hurt. So if I walked in and was like, "Hear, O wife of Mike, I killed a man and got hurt doing it." Like, that's basically what he's saying. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. It's like, I'm sorry, you don't get to make that call. But it's just showing like there's a growing departure farther and farther from God. It's just bad. Now, the reason I bring this up is because what we're doing is we're leading into chapter 5, which is a genealogy. And remember that the chapter divisions were not there in the original. If we want to make any comparison, the chapter divisions, the closest things would have been the Toledotes. Those would have been good breakers for the progress of the book. Okay, so it's like, 2-4 would have been a good break, and then, so on and so forth. But I want you to notice this, because as you get a description of these people who are descendants of Cain and descendants of Seth and descendants of other people, it basically is just laying out, this guy married this person, had this kid, and he married this person, had that kid, and he married that person, had that kid. And it's just a process of this person married, boom, and kid, and married, and boom, and begat, and begat, and begat, and begat, and he withered, and he did. And it's just all this stuff. And it leads all the way into chapter 6, where it says, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them." So I look at the whole chapter 5 leading into chapter 6 as a person, child, person, child, person, child, person, child, person, child, person, child. A lot of people on the earth. It's just kind of your natural progression of the logic. And then as it summarizes in the beginning of chapter 6, which again would have just been continuation of chapter 5, it says, "And it came to pass when men were multiplying on the face of the earth." It says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all that which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he is but flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, they bare children to them, and the same became men which were of old, men of renown. God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." And so we're getting this idea of just this natural progression of humans, and they keep getting farther and farther away from God. But then it reminds us that there were some godly people, and then it draws attention to the fact that God saves some of the godly and destroys the wicked. So I want you to notice that. We're about to take a break and we'll come back and deal with this. But as we kind of cover those genealogies and all of this stuff, it seems to be just this person married that person and that happened, and that person married that person and that happened. And it just continues all the way up until the flood. And then the flood wipes them all out, and then they start over. So we'll get into that in just a sec, but we're going to take a break.